Welcome, everybody. This is the first episode in a brand new show that I'm going to be hosting initially here on YouTube, where I'm going to tackle some questions. We all love comic books. If we didn't, we wouldn't be watching this, we wouldn't be doing this, but we do. So I'm going to be starting this brand new space. It's called Let's Talk Comics. And it's centered around basically answering, I don't know, some simple, um, everyday, mundane questions that we we all have. So let's be honest, we've all got it, right? We've all had that question. We wouldn't be watching this, we wouldn't be doing this, but why do they do this? Why do they do that? Oh my God, do they honestly expect me to blah, 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 whatever it is, right? To believe this, to believe that, to do this or that. And, well, we're always on the up and up, like saying, yeah, maybe not. And there's all the debates. But at the end of the day, if we're absolutely honest, um, we've all got to, I don't know, face up to what the books have to say. Because in the end, it's all there, right? So for my first episode of Let's Talk Comics, I'm going to address a simple, very simple uh, issue, one that we've all we've all done it. You know, when we go and watch a Marvel Comics movie, we're all looking for one person in particular, especially now when we do the reruns and we watch the older movies, we're always looking for one person to come up on the screen. It's it's the one person that is in every single Marvel movie that I can think of. And he never won any Academy Awards. He was never nominated for Best Actor or Best Supporting Actor, even, but he was there all the time, consistent. I'm talking about Stan the Man Lee. He was the defining presence in every single Marvel movie. He was there. And a lot of people are always like, oh my God, look, it's Stan Lee. He's doing a cameo in his movies. How cool is that? Well, you know what? He's been doing that, or he did that, unfortunately. He passed away not too long ago, but he used to do that. But he used to do that long, long before the movies. He was a master, an absolute master at cameos. And he started doing cameos in comic books. He was he was there. He knew, and this is one of the things that's been argued, and in the eternal, never-ending, and absolutely pointless and ridiculous um, debate: is Marvel better than DC Comics? Well, actually, no. Neither is better than the other, which is why they're constantly going back and forth. Each has its own merits. Now, I know purists are going to go mad at me and, oh no, DC Comics is better because of, Marvel Comics is better because It's rooted in the real world. And that is the big argument behind supporting supporting this idea that Marvel is better or not is precisely it's rooted in the real world. And one of the things that you have to you have to understand is yes, he is he was very aware and very keen of making the books relatable to people, even though and and this is the big catch. He was writing about superheroes. He was writing about these wonderful um, supernatural beings who can do incredible things like cling to walls even with their shoes on. It's a little funky when you think about Spider-Man. Like, how can he cling to walls through his shoes? Come on, people. I can understand his socks, whatever glue he has on his feet that is silly ads or whatever it is that makes him stick to walls. Socks, not a problem. But shoes? And anyway, these super people all of a sudden um, start having some sort of relationship with us, right? They're connecting to us. And the way that he did it, because this is down to Stanley. And if you look at it, why are so many, and I mean so many Marvel characters based out of New York City? True, New York is considered by many the capital of the world, and it is a wonderful city. But is that enough to merit every single superhero and their aunt and uncle to come out of New York? There's no superheroes in Chicago, Houston, no, none. New Orleans. I mean, they added some of those later. L.A., Las Vegas. Come on, there's enough great cities and great places in the U.S. Not to mention the rest of the world. I'm not even going to get into the rest of the world. But every superhero comes out of New York. And when he was asked about that, he he said, "Well, I got to write about places I know to make it believable, to make it relatable." And he grew up in New York. That's what he knew. He knew Manhattan. So he wrote about New York. And that made it so much better. So much closer to what the people who were reading the comic books had to say. It was this intimate relationship. We know it. But um, then he went so much further. So much further. And he made it seem like this other world, this comic book world, was right around the corner. It wasn't some far fetched, far flung, incredibly complex and different universe where there's a fictional city in the middle of nowhere. No, this was you and I, and we could run into Spider-Man any day of the week if we lived in New York. He was your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, right? Um, Now, his very, very first cameo was way, way, way back in comic books. He created cameos of himself. He showed up in the comic books, and even before the movies, before anybody thought about showing up to the movies and doing that, he he was there. He was there in the comic books. He was there in the comic books, and he started out with probably All Winners Comics #2. It was a text story. It wasn't a full-fledged comic book. We're talking about the original Captain America from the 1940s, World War II Captain America. Hmm? And he is with Namor when Namor was the Prince of the Seas and not this half mutant, half Atlantean, king of the seas, Aquaman competitor. It was just Namor, right? And you have also the Human Torch, but the Human Torch is not Johnny Storm. The Human Torch is this flaming android, you know, this incredibly I, complicated machine that bursts into flames. And then there's Captain America, the super soldier. But in this All Winners Comics #2, Stan Lee does a text story with some art by Jack Kirby because, of course, it was Lee and Kirby who were together um, working on creating this entirely new brand of stories, right? And in this story, the superheroes meet, and you're going to have a blast. Wizard and the Destroyer join other heroes, and they run into the editor of All Winners, who is none other than Stan Lee, and they convince him that they should be allowed to join the series. This is, I mean, we praise Cervantes for making Don Quixote realize that he was a character in a novel. Stan Lee made it absolutely clear for his characters that they, in themselves, were characters in their own novels, in their own comic books. And he ran into them, right? He ran into his own characters, and they held conversations, and this was this was incredible. Then he went on in 1947 to narrate. He did this book that was called The Secrets Behind the Comics, and he was um, he was a member. He was narrating the story and telling how this is done. Right now, these were all hit and miss. Was there really a cameo? Wasn't he there? But his very first real appearance was in Astonishing #4, which was by Hank Chapman and Wayne Boring, right? And it's a story about a comic book writer who forces himself to have terrible nightmares, and then those terrible nightmares inspire him to write his way out of the nightmares. And well, these are some of the stories that he was telling at the time. And in the middle of these nightmares, he doesn't like the fact that the nightmares are winning, right? So Stan Lee, the editor, comes in to save this um, writer who is being mistreated by his own nightmares, right? Um, and that was his first foray into it, and he will go on to show himself as the editor. Now, probably one of the most famous cameos um, or is in Fantastic Four. Fantastic Four was the comic book that brought Stan Lee and eventually Marvel Comics to fame. Right? And everybody knows the story about Stan Lee wanting to um, wanting to quit Marvel and deciding to do the one last story that was going to redefine and say, if I'm going out, I'm going out with a bang, right? But it didn't happen. Luckily for all of us, he didn't truly quit. He was in Fantastic Four in the very beginning, like at the very, very start, number four, annual number three, he was in. And he shows up and they talk about him being the editor. But then out of everything, he went on to Spider-Man. And even though Fantastic Four was his piece, his great starting point, his absolute favorite, and he was not shy to say it, was always Spider-Man. Spider-Man was his little boy, right? And unlike the Fantastic Four, this was not Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. This was Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Kirby and Lee would eventually get into this huge fight that would lead to Jack Kirby going over to DC Comics. Thank God for that, because otherwise we would not have had the entire New Gods and Apocalypse and this entire saga that comes with Darkseid and New Genesis. All of that is Jack Kirby messing with Superman when he went over to DC Comics. Now, Steve Ditko remained with Marvel Comics. He was different. The relationship was different. And there was never any issue between who created what. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko create Spider-Man. And this is Spider-Man Annual number 1, 1964. And it's right there in bold blue letters with a yellow background. This is at the very end of the comic book. This is on the last 3 pages of the book, right? Annual books were a thing. It was one book a year that was supposed to summarize, and it was the opportunity for the writers to do the creative, crazy, incredible things. And it was a 60-page book, and they could go beyond the 22, 24 pages that they did every week. So in this case, they had how Stan Lee and Steve Ditko create Spider-Man. And it is this story of them. Um, and it's there. It's there for the world to see. Nobody's putting it away. Nobody is saying, nope, nope, I didn't do this or I did more than that. It was written. And this was a lesson, right, from 1964. So they have this wonderful, wonderful thing. And when we look down into what is actually happening there, the first panel is wonderful. The first page, under that bold blue lettering, we have images of, on the left hand side, a very young Stan Lee and a very young Steve Ditko. And behind Steve Ditko, we can see Doctor Strange, Stephen Strange, pointing out like this and going like, sleep. Okay? And in the very, very left hand side, we also have Doctor Strange raising his hands like this and going like, you, Steve, Stan Lee, are mine. But the difference is that Stan is surrounded by, first of all, Captain America, who he worked with, Jack Kirby. Captain America was created by Jack Kirby. Then we have the Wasp, and we have Ant-Man, Iron Man, the X-Men. Spider-Man himself is there. Um, Marvel Girl, which is Sue Storm, the Invisible Girl. Off of the frame, you can't really see it, but at the bottom there's Ben Grimm, the Thing, and then there's Thor, and the new Human Torch, um, Johnny Storm. Now, there, at the bottom of the page, you can see Steve Ditko has a drawing, a pencil drawing of Spider-Man. There's also, of all people, um, Nick Fury. And I'm going to zoom in if I can and show you down here. Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos at the bottom of the frame. It's Dum Dum Dugan and Nick Fury and Stan's signature. Unfortunately, you can't properly see. Um, you can't properly see the different characters there that are at the very, very bottom of the frame. I'm going to try and move it up a bit, and there we go. It's Stan's signature, Nick Fury, and Dum Dum Dugan. There they are, in all their wonderful, wonderful glory. All right. Um, so in this story, in this very 1964 style story, it's only 3 pages tacked at the very end of the annual, the 1964 annual of Spider-Man. Stan and Steve create this story where basically they're going to say, and as they say, on these 3 pages, Stan, he's still not signed as Stan the Man. Stan and Steve reveal how they created Spider-Man. If I can just go back and show you. It, it says, and on these 3 pages, Stan and Steve really unwind and have some fun. We hope you'll enjoy this featurette as much as they enjoyed doing it. So they're telling us, you know what, this is a joke. We're playing with you guys with this, Steve and I. And I'm not going to read the whole story because there's a lot more ground to cover for for Stan. But I will be sharing with you this. So this is the first panel, the first three panels of that story. And for some unknown reason, inspirations only seem to come to old Stan in the middle of the night. And anybody who has ever had to get out of bed at 2 in the morning with a brilliant idea for whatever it is, the next great um, product for our company, or the solution to that math problem that we haven't been able to solve all day in school, whatever it is, that inspiration only comes in the middle of the night, right? We've all been there. And hey, Mr. Puyana, welcome. What brings you to this neck of the woods? Lovely to see you. All right. So as I was saying, we've all been in that situation. Middle of the night, we wake up, right? Same thing happens to Stan, and he goes, "Wow, what an idea for a Spider-Man epic! Valva boom! I'd better phone Steve and wake him right up. He won't mind." And if you're thinking about it, and you're Steve Ditko, you're probably going like, "Oh my God, if I could just tell my boss to go to hell and leave me alone. It's late at night." Well, he probably would. But then, and so a short time later, they're together, and Steve, we can see him going like, ugh. And Strand, how about that, Stevie boy? And just for kicks, we'll do 12 panels to each page. What do you mean, we? Says Steve. I do the drawing while you practice signing your name all over. And that sounds very much like Stan Lee, like putting his name all over the place and going crazy, crazy with himself. Eh, look, bub, and I'm going to give you an interesting, if you've never read it or seen it or anything, bub is Wolverine speak all over the place. Listen, bub. That would be Wolverine in a few years. Wolverine wasn't in the picture yet. He would come in, and he won't come in through the X-Men. He'll come in through the Hulk as the enemy of the Hulk. But then, look, bub, who gave you your first job, taught you how to draw, bought you your first pair of shoes? And then Steve replies, I'm not. Who? It sure wasn't you, Lee. I was a happy man till we teamed up. Now, even my ulcers have ulcers. And then he moves on to next three panels, where again we see this very comical Stan Lee. After the usual friendly story conference, Stan gives Steve the script and then leaves to have a similar fight with Jack Kirby. Meanwhile, Steve begins work on the new Spider-Man tale. There's a scene in the story involving the Statue of Liberty. I better get some reference material for myself. A few hours later, Sunny Steve gets another cheery call from Stan. Lee, you're a nut. How can the strip be 2 weeks late already? You just gave it to me this morning. Oh, yeah? Well, the same to you. Millions of writers in the business, and I have to team up with an eager beaver. Oh, well, I might as well start roughing in the first panel. This entire featurette of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko will set the tone for quite a few of their comic books and a lot of the things that we will see later. And it doesn't end. I mean, we're talking 1964. And we saw Stan Lee doing cameos in film pretty much. The last cameo came out after he died. It's that's how big this thing was for him. Now, another one that is pretty interesting is the fact that in many of the comics, Stan puts himself in context. Um, and we see a lot of Stan's banter and personality and things coming through. And many of them, unfortunately, I don't have the comic book. We are talking about 40, 50, 60-year-old comic books. I don't have access to them and I can't show you the images, but he will place himself in context and make the story more relatable. There's one where Spidey is climbing up the wall of the Marvel Comics building in New York, in Park Avenue. And Stan is outside the window, like leaning in a little bit like this with his arm on the windowsill. And he's going like, yeah, well, look at this beautiful New York. And then Spidey's climbing up the wall and he runs into Stan and Stan says, "Hey, Spidey." And then Spidey goes like, "Dude, Stan, lovely to see you, but I gotta run. After this crook or whatever." And he just moves on. And it's like, oh, Stan goes like, "Yeah, Spidey's always on the move, right?" So many of those, unfortunately, as I said, I don't have access to the images to show you, but that is his tone. He is very close to his own creations and he's constantly talking to them. There's another one that I don't have that is for Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos. For those of you who don't know, Nick Fury started out with his own comic book. And his own comic book was about a World War II sergeant who took no grief from command, who got the toughest missions completed with his ragtag band of misfits, including an African American trumpet player who was a master at playing jazz. But of course, it's World War II. Everybody has to do their bit for Uncle Sam, right? And then we come to other things. And Nick Fury, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry for that. Nick Fury, going back, the bugle player and everybody. And it and I lost my train of thought because Thomas just joined in and said hello and saying he loves it. Thank you for that, Thomas. It's encouragement to keep on going and keep on trucking. So Nick Fury is going through an airstrip. He needs to get to an airplane. And there is this guy drawing a pinup girl, a 1940s pinup girl on the airplane. And up comes this guy and says to him, like, "Hey, Private Ditko." "Yes, Corporal Lee." And you got to remember, Stan Lee was, in fact, a corporal in World War II. He was actually a member of the Army. And it's, "Yes, Corporal Lee. Hey, you're pretty good with a pencil. You know, when the war's over, I plan to write comic books. How would you like to be my artist and draw my comic books for me?" And there we have Stan Lee on the comic books, Corporal Stan Lee during World War II, telling Steve Ditko, "Hey, will you be my artist after the war is over?" Which is exactly what happened. Right? So these little cameos and these things about Stan Lee, they are part of what made Um, Part of what made the Marvel Comics bonanza or the golden age of Marvel Comics, this is the time where Marvel Comics would. Thank you for that, Lewis. I'm glad you're enjoying it. This is when Marvel Comics was doing something and then DC Comics would copy it. It was like, oh, they're doing red covers, we're doing red covers as well. And it had to do with that, with the fact that people could truly, truly relate to them and you could see them and sometimes they would sneak themselves in without even saying it was them, you know? But they knew it was their joke, their internal like bullpen joke of, oh, we've put ourselves into a comic book. And sometimes it was obvious, like I've said, the ones I've shown, where it's clear Stan and the other artists are in it. But sometimes it's a lot more subtle. And for example, in 1967, again, in an annual, and annuals back in the 60s used to be that place where comic book artists, especially in Marvel Comics, had the opportunity to experiment and play because they knew that if anything happened, well, they could just say, hey, it was an annual, nobody will read it, or it won't affect the story. But it's this. In 1967, Daredevil annual number 1, we get this little panel on the right hand side. On the left hand side, we have Daredevil swinging off of a building. And if you'd known New York at that time, you would recognize the building as the building where Marvel Comics had its offices. Okay? So to read a little bit of the panel, a few seconds after putting down the phone, the sightless swashbuckler wastes no time in getting himself back to his peak fighting form. A good night's sleep was all I needed. I feel like I could tackle a regiment now if I had to. And with Elektra and his playmates voting me their target for tonight, I may just have to. Thus, for the next few hours, in homes and offices throughout the city, this somewhat soul stirring cry rings out. Look, there's Daredevil, swinging from the rooftops above us. What with him and Spider Man and Thor and the Human Torch and all the other costume cats around here, we'll have to keep the shades down to get any work done in this town. And the one pointing out the window is none other than Stan Lee. So it's those kinds of little nods here and there that Stan is constantly doing, right? Showing himself off, putting himself in the stories. And that serves the purpose of bringing the people together, like making them come close to where we are. Now, another moving forward in time a little bit closer to us. Uh, Now we're moving into the 70s, and we're going to get a very different look into Stan Lee, into what he's doing, and the way the art and the pictures and everything is going to change in the 1970s. Um, and he, but he's still there, and it's the same thing. It's the same story. It's him being the editor. But here we're talking about the X-Men. And the X-Men were some of the last creations of Stan Lee. as a writer, because before he became the chief editor and the head honcho over at Marvel. This is a Christmas special for it is the X-Men number 98. The Sentinels are back. And this number has an additional. Not only does it have a cameo by Stan Lee, it also features the first appearance of the one who will be eventually uh, Charles Xavier's wife, Lilandra Naramani. And the cameo that I told you about is on the third page. It's one of the very first pages of the book. And it's this one right here, where we have this wonderful, wonderful image. And you can see the colors, the dress, the outfits, everything. And it's Jean Grey at the very front with Scott Summers, Cyclops. And Jean Grey says to Cyclops, "Didn't you hear me, you big lug? I said, kiss me." And plants a big wet kiss on him. And today, 2020, we might go like, yeah, well, big deal. They kissed. But when you read the rest of the text, you start realizing that there's a little bit more there. And it says, Cyclops replies, "Gene, and you can just hear in your head what's happening. But then we have these two people in the background in their very uh, cool cat attitude, cigarettes or cigars hanging out the edges of their mouth. All right? Mustache on one, close crop, and turtleneck, very swagger. And one of them says to the other, "Hey, Stan, you know who they were? I tell you, they never used to do that when we had the book. Ah, Jack, you know these young kids, they got no respect." And then we have Stan Lee and Jack Kirby having a conversation about how when they were running the show on the X-Men books, Jean and and Scott would never have kissed in public like that, right? They never would have. But hey, they're no longer in charge. So guess what? Times are moving on. And that is part of the beauty. That is part of the beauty of what they're doing. It's keeping up that conversation with the audience, with who with us, right? The reader. We're getting that. We're getting a peek into their minds. And that will move on in time uh, into today, into the movies, into having Stan Lee pop up and be a guy, an old guy, hosing down his lawn and seeing the water shoot up, all of a sudden going like, whoa, or being the hot dog vendor, or being I don't know, so many things, or being Hugh Hefner, playing Hugh Hefner in Iron Man. That's that's totally within character of Stan, right? Now I'm gonna jump ahead some 20 years, uh, something like that, more than 20 years. We were in the 1970s, right? And now we are moving into the 2000s. In between, there's appearances in the Avenger. There's appearances in, again, Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos. He shows up again in the Fantastic Four, in Spider-Man, in Daredevil. He's there. He's there, and he's showing up in all of these comic books. But then we come to the 2000s, and in the 2000s, something interesting happens in Marvel Comics. And it is that it all changes. It is known as the Brian Michael Bendis era, and it's the era of events where every single book is related to everything else, right? And we have these incredible stories of Avengers disassembled, and we have New Avengers, and we have Civil War, and Secret War, and we have Secret Invasion, Heroic Age, all of the things that led to where the Marvel Universe is right now. And in the midst of this, there's still time for Stan Lee to sneak in and do cameos and appearances, and it's things he's still very much, and he hasn't been involved in writing the comic books for 30, 40 years at this point. But he is still such a strong and commanding presence within Marvel that he's there, right? And we just have to acknowledge the contribution and the power that and the role that Stan Lee played in making the Marvel universe what it is, what it became, keeping that sense of unity. Now, if we go to New Avengers, New Avengers, and you you've got to remember this is what comes after Avengers Disassembled. In Avengers Disassembled, most of the Avengers are killed. And but in New Avengers, annual #1, and again, it's not a coincidence that it's in the annual. Avengers Disassembled #1, 2006. Luke Cage is marrying Jessica Drew. Right? She's pregnant, and they're going to be parents. And Luke has just proposed to her, and she said yes, and they're getting married. So we have this wonderful, beautiful wedding scene right here. And the pastor is saying, into this, these two now come to be joined. If anyone present can show just and legal cause why they may not be joined, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Lucas, will you have this woman as your lawful wedded wife to live together in the state of matrimony? And then we have this wonderful change of frame. And who is the pastor? None other than Stan Lee. Will you love her, honor her, comfort her, and keep her in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, and be true to her as long as you both shall live? And there he is, with his glasses and his mustache. And at this point, white sides on his hair like salt and pepper. And Luke says, sure. And she just looks at him and goes like, Jessica, will you have this man as your lawful wedded husband to live together in the state of matrimony? And we get this state of a close up of Stan's face. Will you love him, honor him? Oops, sorry about that. That's the problem with having Too many. Will you love him, honor him, comfort him, and keep him in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, and be true to him as long as you both shall live? And that, those goggles and that smile, and let me just transition out a minute so I can show you the rest of the frame. There we are. That's Stan Lee, 100%. 100% Stan Lee all over, right? And then we have this beautiful wedding scene. And then Jessica goes on to say, I will, for as much as Luke and Jessica have consented. And then everything, like in any good comic book, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. But the important thing here is that Stan um, is the pastor in the wedding, and he goes on for two more pages, and then Luke and Jessica are married, and they kiss, and then Stan is out of the picture for good in this issue. He'll be back in others, maybe not uh, in New Avengers. He will be back in Thunderbolts, which is the Marvel version of Suicide Squad. He'll be back in Fantastic Force. He's in X Force. There's even one that is Stan Lee meets Doctor Doom, and Doctor Doom kidnaps Stan and takes him to Latveria to keep keep him there and have him, right? So as you can see, that decision by Stan Lee to be a part of the Marvel universe in such a way played a huge, huge role in the power and the popularity of Marvel Comics back in the 60s, back in the 70s and 80s, and it's what still a lot of people argue that Marvel Comics is more attuned with people than DC Comics, and to that I have to say, you know what? Not true. Not true. DC Comics has its own way of addressing its closeness to people. It's not as in your face as this, but it's there. It's for example the fact that for many many years in the 1990s, uh, in Superman comic books, any cab that a character took anywhere in Metropolis would be 650, and 650 was the exact price of a cab fare between DC Comics and Marvel Comics in New York City at the time. So it was a tip of the hat, a nod, an acknowledgement to each other. So if you're one of those people who say that, oh, this one's better or that one's better, don't. They're both in the business of entertaining us, of making great stories, and they each have their own way of approaching different problems. And what you have to think is, which kind of story do I enjoy the most? Do I like to see Stan Lee in the pages constantly reminding me that these characters are not real, right? And to leave you off with a last Stan Lee cameo, this is in Thunderbolts 112 2006. Tonight at 8 on the SF Net, Who Wants to Be a Thunderbolt? With Stan Lee! And he's dressed like Uncle Sam. That's right, true believers. The Thunderbolts have opened a training program for a second backup team, and we're offering ordinary Americans the chance to fight evil. That phrase, true believers, is something that was very, very Stan. Um, Same as the word Excelsior or the Merry Marvel Marching Society. All those kind of alliterations. Peter Parker, Odo Octavius, Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Matt Murdock, Daredevil, all those alliterations and names, they all come down to Stan. They- They're all around this wonderful, wonderful man who gave us these many, many, many stories about incredible feats, about believing in yourself. And he didn't fear doing this and breaking the mold and just being who he is. And again, hiding down there in Insurgency Town are Captain America, the Falcon, and other rogue superhumans. Our contestants have just one day to devise their superhero identities and power gear before going into Insurgency Town to try and take them out. Whoever wins today's contest goes into the semifinals, competing against previous week's winners such as Stabby Jones and his knife suit. And you can just see old Stan, full glory with the glasses and the Uncle Sam hat and the mustache. And he ages. Hillfang's flamethrower mask. Doomstomp and his gasoline-powered death boots. Don't you want to be out on the streets of America cleaning up evil? Who wants to be a thunderbolt? Tonight at 8, Excelsior. There you have it, folks. Excelsior. Stanley's catchphrase, catchword, his absolute go-to sentence, his absolute go-to phrase. Excelsior. So, and with that Excelsior in mind, I hope everybody has enjoyed this stream. If you did, and if you want to ask questions, to follow me on Twitter at DadroCant, I will be there answering questions. Your questions drive streams like this one. This one came out of a conversation with a friend. Send me your inquiries. I will make my best to find the information, find the comic books, show you what is there, and let's have fun. But above everything, let's talk comics, guys. And this has been Daddercant, and I'm out.